In the middle of the 14th century, the world was struck by a catastrophe so profound that it altered the course of human history. The Black Death, a devastating pandemic caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, swept across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia with unprecedented speed and lethality. Arriving in Europe in 1347, it annihilated populations in towns and villages, sparing neither the rich nor the poor. It is estimated that within just a few years, the plague claimed the lives of between a third and a half of Europe's population. Yet while the immediate impact was horrific, the long-term effects of this catastrophe were equally transformative, reshaping society, economics, religion, and even the way people thought about life and death. Before the plague arrived, medieval Europe was already under strain. Population growth over the preceding centuries had pushed resources to their limits. Many peasants lived in poverty, bound by feudal obligations, and the land was heavily cultivated to feed the swelling numbers. This delicate balance collapsed when the plague struck. Entire communities were wiped out, and the sudden and massive loss of life left fields untended. Harvests ruined and villages abandoned. The countryside, once bustling with activity, became eerily silent as both laborers and landowners succumbed to the disease. Economically, the Black Death shattered the old feudal order. With so many workers dead, labor became a precious commodity. Surviving peasants discovered they could demand better wages, and many left their lords' estates in search of more favorable terms elsewhere. This labor shortage gave rise to new freedoms for the lower classes, breaking the rigid social hierarchy that had defined medieval life. In some regions, governments tried to freeze wages and bind workers to their land to maintain the status quo, but these measures often failed. Over time, the imbalance between the needs of landowners and the bargaining power of laborers contributed to the erosion of serfdom in Western Europe. The plague also transformed the physical landscape. Abandoned farmland reverted to wilderness, and in some areas, livestock grazed on once cultivated fields. Cities and towns, though devastated, began to rebuild with new ideas about space and sanitation. Narrow, cramped streets that had once been breeding grounds for disease were gradually opened up. While medical knowledge at the time was primitive, the connection between overcrowding and illness began to take root, sowing the seeds for future public health measures. Religion was another realm deeply shaken by the Black Death. The sheer scale of the suffering challenged people's faith in the church, which had been a cornerstone of medieval life. Clergymen, like everyone else, were not immune, and many perished while tending to the sick. The inability of religious leaders to stop the plague or provide satisfactory explanations led some to question the church's authority. Others clung to their faith with even greater fervor, seeking redemption through prayer, pilgrimage, and acts of penance. Movements like the Flagellants, who whipped themselves in public to atone for humanity's sins, gained temporary popularity before being condemned by church authorities. Over time, the disillusionment sown by the plague contributed to a gradual decline in the unquestioned dominance of religious institutions. The intellectual world, too, shifted in the wake of the pandemic. Confronted with death on such a scale, people began to think differently about their place in the world. The fragility of life became an undeniable reality, and this awareness seeped into art, literature, and philosophy. The macabre imagery of skeletons and decaying bodies found its way into paintings, carvings, and manuscripts, a reflection of the omnipresence of death. At the same time, there was a growing interest in human experience in the material world, paving the way for the Renaissance. The emphasis on individual achievement and worldly beauty that characterized Renaissance art and thought can, in part, be traced to the cultural upheaval of the plague years. The pandemic also altered patterns of trade and communication. The initial spread of the disease was facilitated by trade routes, particularly those linking Europe to Asia through the Silk Road and Mediterranean ports. In the aftermath, some of these routes declined as fear of contagion lingered. However, eventual recovery of trade was accompanied by changes in the way goods were transported and markets were organized. Merchants began to diversify their sources and routes, and some cities that had suffered heavily in the first wave of the plague lost their dominance to emerging centers of commerce. On a more intimate level, the Black Death reshaped family life and personal relationships. The high mortality rate meant that inheritance patterns changed almost overnight. Some families found themselves unexpectedly wealthy due to the deaths of relatives, while others were left destitute. The trauma of losing loved ones in such rapid succession left deep emotional scars. Many survivors were forced to take on new roles, whether managing estates, running businesses, or caring for orphaned children. Marriages were sometimes hastened as people sought companionship and stability in uncertain times, while in other cases, grief and fear delayed the formation of new households. The pandemic's impact on medicine was complex. Medieval physicians had little understanding of the true cause of the plague, often attributing it to bad air, planetary alignments, or divine punishment. Treatments ranged from herbal remedies to bloodletting, none of which were effective against the deadly bacterium. However, the sheer scale of the crisis exposed the limitations of existing medical knowledge and spurred efforts to improve it. Universities began to place greater emphasis on the study of anatomy and disease, slowly moving away from ancient texts toward direct observation and experience. Though it would take centuries for germ theory to emerge, Black Death marked an early turning point in the pursuit of scientific approaches to health. Even the environment was affected. The dramatic drop in population meant that forests regrew in many parts of Europe. Wildlife flourished in areas once dominated by agriculture, and the demand for resources like firewood and game temporarily eased. Some historians have suggested that this rewilding of the land may have had subtle effects on the climate, contributing to shifts in weather patterns during the following centuries. Politically, the plague destabilized kingdoms and altered the course of wars. Rulers who survived found themselves governing diminished and often restless populations. Tax revenues plummeted due to the reduced workforce, and in some regions, peasant uprisings erupted when governments tried to impose harsh measures to stabilize the economy. In England, for instance, resentment over wage controls and taxation helped spark the peasants' revolt of 1381. The loss of key political figures to the disease also led to succession crises and shifts in alliances. The memory of the Black Death lingered for generations. Fear of its return influenced public policy, with quarantines and health boards established in some cities to monitor outbreaks. The very word quarantine comes from the Italian quarantena, referring to the 40 days that ships were required to remain isolated before their crews could disembark. While these measures were not always effective, they represented an early attempt at systematic disease control. In cultural terms, the Black Death left behind a legacy of caution and pragmatism alongside a zest for life. For some, the experience of surviving such a catastrophe encouraged a more worldly outlook, a desire to seize opportunities and enjoy pleasures while they lasted. For others, the trauma deepened a sense of fatalism. Both attitudes found expression in the art, music, and literature of the time, shaping the creative output of the late Middle Ages and early Renaissance. It is difficult to overstate the degree to which the Black Death reshaped the trajectory of human civilization. It was not simply a moment of mass mortality, but a catalyst for change in nearly every aspect of life. The rigid structures of feudal society began to crack. New economic relationships emerged, and the intellectual seeds of the Renaissance were sown in soil enriched by tragedy and loss. Religion adapted to new realities. Medicine began its slow march toward modernity, and the world's cultural imagination was forever marked by the shadow of the plague. Today, the story of the Black Death remains both a cautionary tale and a testament to human resilience. It reminds us that pandemics do not merely take lives, they transform societies. The world that emerged in the aftermath of the 14th century was not the same as the one that entered it. In the silence that followed the plague's most devastating years, humanity began to rebuild, reimagine, and redefine itself. Out of a period of unimaginable suffering came not only sorrow, but also renewal. A pattern that history has repeated in different forms ever since. The Black Death stands as a grim milestone in the shared human journey, a reminder that even in the darkest times, the world can and does change forever. And that brings us to the end of our journey through one of the most transformative chapters in human history. The Black Death was not just a wave of sickness that swept across continents. It was a force that tore down old systems and reshaped the world in ways people living through it could never have imagined. From the collapse of feudal structures to the birth of new economic freedoms, from the questioning of religious authority to the spark of intellectual curiosity that would help fuel the Renaissance, the legacy of the plague still echoes in our lives today. It is a sobering reminder of how fragile our societies can be and how quickly everything we take for granted can change. But it is also a testament to human adaptability. Out of unimaginable loss came reinvention, resilience, and a reimagining of what life could be. History shows us that even in the darkest moments, people rebuild, adapt, and find new ways to move forward. If you found this story as fascinating as it is haunting, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more journeys into the past. The lessons of history are never truly over, and there is always more to uncover together.